Begin with the earth itself. Beneath your feet, beneath the leaf litter and the topsoil, beneath the roots of oak and pine, there exists a network older than empires. It is not a brain, though it thinks in its own way. It is not a society, though it cooperates beyond anything humans have managed. It is mycelium, the hidden body of the fungus, and it has been here, silent and patient, long before the first human eye opened to wonder. A mushroom, the part we see, is merely the fruit. The organism itself lives below, spreading in threads finer than hair, weaving through darkness, trading sugars with tree roots, breaking down the dead into nourishment for the living. This is the work of fungi, quiet, essential, invisible. The mushroom rises only briefly, a messenger sent up to scatter spores, then collapses back into soil and memory. Species number in the thousands. Some glow faintly in the dark. Others grow shelf-like on dying trees, patient architects of decay. Some are prized by chefs, their flesh nutty and dense. Others will kill you, shutting down your liver cell by cell, offering no antidote, no reprieve. And some, a small collection scattered across continents, contain molecules that, when consumed, alter the very texture of consciousness itself. These are the psilocybin mushrooms, small, unassuming, brown-capped or blue-bruising, growing in meadows and forests, on wood chips and dung. They do not advertise their power, they simply grow, reproduce and wait. What they wait for, no one can say. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. The fungus does not know it is psychoactive. It produces psilocybin as we produce bile or tears, a biochemical fact, not a philosophy. Yet this molecule, this arrangement of carbon and nitrogen and hydrogen, fits into human neurology like a key into a lock that evolution never intended to open. Let us speak plainly of chemistry. Psilocybin is a prodrug, a compound that becomes active only after the body transforms it. When ingested, enzymes in the gut and liver remove a phosphate group, and what remains is psilocin, the molecule that crosses into the brain and begins its work. Psilocin is structurally similar to serotonin, a neurotransmitter your body uses to regulate mood, sleep and perception. The resemblance is not metaphorical. Under a microscope, the two molecules could be siblings. This structural mimicry allows psilocin to bind to serotonin receptors, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor, and in doing so it shifts the patterns of communication between brain regions. Imagine a city at night viewed from above. Normally traffic flows along established routes, highways bright with headlights, neighbourhoods dimly connected, certain districts speaking mostly to themselves. The default mode network, a collection of brain regions active during rest and self-reflection, hums along its usual pathways. The visual cortex processes input. The prefrontal cortex plans and judges. Each network knows its role. Now, imagine that traffic signals change. New roads light up. Neighbourhoods that rarely communicated suddenly exchange information. The default mode network, which typically maintains your sense of self, your autobiography, your boundary between me and not me, quiets. Other networks, visual, auditory, emotional, begin to crosstalk in unusual ways. This is what imaging studies suggest happens during a psilocybin experience. Increased global connectivity, decreased activity in the brain's conductor. The result is not chaos, but a different order, a temporary rewiring that some describe as liberating, others as disorienting, and most as profound. The molecule does not create meaning. It creates conditions. What happens within those conditions depends on 1,000 variables. The person, the place, the moment, the intention. Chemistry is only the opening of a door. What lies beyond the threshold cannot be reduced to receptor binding, though it begins there. Within hours, the silicon is metabolized and excreted. The receptors return to their baseline sensitivity. The traffic patterns of the brain re-establish their familiar routes. But something, often, has shifted. Memory has encoded the experience. Perspective has tilted even slightly. The door, though closed, is remembered. The relationship between humans and psychoactive mushrooms stretches back into the shadows of prehistory, where evidence becomes symbol and symbol becomes speculation. We must tread carefully here, acknowledging what we know and confessing what we merely guess. In the highlands of Mesoamerica, the Aztec and Maya spoke of Teonanacatl, flesh of the gods, a term Spanish chroniclers recorded with a mixture of fascination and horror. Bernardino de Sahagún, a Franciscan friar writing in the 16th century, described mushrooms consumed at feasts, leading to visions, laughter, weeping, and revelations. His tone was one of concern. The Church saw in these practices a rival claim to the divine, an unmediated communion that bypassed priest and sacrament alike. Stone sculptures from Guatemala, dated to 1000 BCE or earlier, depict figures with mushroom-like caps rising from their heads or shoulders. Are these literal mushrooms or symbolic crowns? The question remains open. Interpretation runs ahead of evidence, as it often does when the past is silent and the present is eager for meaning. Further north, in the regions that would become the southwestern United States, rock art sometimes includes forms that resemble mushrooms, or perhaps not. Scholars disagree, and the artist left no commentary. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is resemblance proof of practice. Across the ocean, in Siberia, the Koryak and Chukchi peoples gathered Amanita muscaria, the red and white fly agaric mushroom, during winter ceremonies. Reindeer consumed them. Humans consumed reindeer urine, which filtered the toxic compounds while preserving the psychoactive ones. Ethnographers recorded these practices in the 19th and 20th centuries, though by then contact with Russian Orthodox Christianity and Soviet authority had already altered or suppressed many traditions. In Europe, whispers and fragments, fairy rings and folk prohibitions, mushrooms associated with madness or enchantment, ergot poisoning mistaken for witchcraft, psilocybin species growing in English meadows unrecognised. The mycelial network of culture spreads quietly, and not all threads are visible from above. What unites these scattered examples is not a single tradition, but a recurring pattern. Societies encountering altered states and building frameworks, ritual, mythological, communal, to contain and interpret them. The mushroom does not teach, it catalyses. Humans, faced with unusual perception, reach for story and structure to make sense of the unsensible. We should be cautious. To romanticize these practices is to flatten their complexity. To dismiss them as primitive superstition is to ignore their sophistication. Somewhere between reverence and skepticism lies a more honest acknowledgement. People have long sought meaning in unusual states, and mushrooms have been one doorway among many. When a human ingests a molecule that alters perception, what happens next depends enormously on context. The molecule is neutral, the mind is not. Into this gap, cultures have poured ritual, the architecture of meaning that transforms chemistry into ceremony. Consider the Mazatec Velada, a healing ritual documented in Oaxaca, Mexico in the mid-20th century. The ceremony occurred at night, in darkness or by candlelight. The healer, often a woman, a curandera, prepared the mushrooms, sometimes grinding them, sometimes serving them whole. Participants fasted beforehand. The space was prepared, clean, quiet, safe. Intentions were spoken aloud, healing for a sick child, clarity about a difficult decision, reconciliation with a departed ancestor. Once the mushrooms were consumed, the curandera began to sing. These were not performances but navigational tools, rhythms and melodies that provided structure when her interior experience became formless. The songs named spirits described journeys, called for protection. They were maps sung into being, and those who listened could orient themselves by the sound even when sight became strange. Hours passed. Participants lay down, closed their eyes, or sat in silence. The curandera watched, attended, adjusted. If someone grew fearful, she sang them back to calm. If someone needed to speak, she listened. The role was not to direct the experience, but to hold the space. A function part therapist, part priestess, part witness. At dawn, the ceremony ended. Participants returned to ordinary consciousness slowly, like divers ascending in stages. Integration began immediately. What was seen? What was felt? What does it mean for the life that continues beyond this night? The ritual did not end with the molecules, metabolism. It extended into interpretation, application, and community acknowledgement. This pattern, preparation, intention, guided experience, and integration, appears across cultures and centuries. In the Native American church, peyote ceremonies follow a similar structure. fasting, prayer, song, drumming, a night-long vigil and morning resolution. In Amazonian ayahuasca traditions, the curandero sings icaros, protective melodies that guide participants through visions. In Bwiti ceremonies in Gabon, iboga is consumed within a tightly structured initiation that may last days, surrounded by elders and accompanied by music. The common thread is not the molecule, but the container. Unusual states, these societies understood, are powerful but not inherently meaningful. Meaning is constructed through intention, safeguarded through structure, and validated through community. The mushroom opens the door. The ritual ensures that what enters and exits does so with care. Modern culture in many places lost these containers. Psychedelics, when they returned in the 20th century, often arrived without ritual, without elders, without the accumulated wisdom of safe passage. The results were sometimes transcendent, sometimes disastrous, and often somewhere in between. Raw experiences looking for a framework that no longer existed. The Western re-encounter with psilocybin mushrooms began not with scientists but with travellers. In 1955, R. Gordon Wasson, a banker and amateur mycologist, travelled to Oaxaca and participated in a velada led by Maria Sabina, a Mazatec healer. He returned to New York and published an account in Life magazine in 1957, introducing millions of readers to the idea that mushrooms could occasion mystical experiences. The article was sensational in both senses, widely read and inflammatory. Within years, seekers flooded into Oaxaca, disrupting traditions, disrespecting boundaries, and turning sacred ceremony into tourist curiosity. Maria Sabina later expressed regret, saying that the mushrooms lost their power when treated as entertainment rather than medicine. The cost of publicity is often invisibility, the quiet truth drowned out by noise. But Wasson's account also reached scientists. Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had synthesized LSD, isolated and identified psilocybin and psilocin in 1958. For the first time, the active compounds could be studied in controlled doses, independent of mushroom variability. Research began at Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and other institutions, exploring therapeutic potential for alcoholism, depression, and end-of-life anxiety. Then came Prohibition. By the early 1970s, cultural panic over psychedelics, fueled by recreational misuse, media sensationalism, and political opportunism, led to their classification as Schedule I substances in the United States and similar restrictions worldwide. Research halted, funding vanished. For 2 decades, the conversation went underground or silent. The resurgence began quietly in the 1990s. A few researchers, undeterred by stigma and bureaucratic obstacles, obtained permission to restart clinical trials. At Johns Hopkins, Roland Griffiths and colleagues designed rigorous studies, double-blind, placebo-controlled, with careful screening and trained facilitators. Participants were healthy volunteers or patients with treatment-resistant depression, cancer-related anxiety, or addiction. The studies found consistently that psilocybin, when administered in supportive settings with psychological preparation and follow-up, produced significant and sustained improvements in mood, anxiety, and quality of life. Participants often described their sessions as among the most meaningful experiences of their lives, comparable to the birth of a child or the death of a parent. Brain imaging confirmed changes in network connectivity. Questionnaires measuring mystical type experiences scored high. These were not miracle cures. Some participants had difficult sessions, benefits varied, not everyone responded, but the signal was clear enough to attract funding, replicate findings, and shift regulatory attitudes. By the 2020s, psilocybin therapy had received breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA for depression, and clinical pathways were opening in several countries. The modern research model differs fundamentally from recreational use. Sessions occur in controlled environments, comfortable rooms with soft lighting, carefully curated music, trained guides present throughout. Participants undergo screening to exclude those at risk for psychosis or severe mental illness. Preparation sessions establish trust and set intentions. Integration sessions afterward help translate experience into insight, and insight into behavior change. This is not shamanism, but it borrows from the same insight. Setting, and support shape outcomes. The molecule is the same whether consumed on a mountaintop, in a laboratory, or at a music festival. What changes is the container, and the container changes everything. To understand what psilocybin does, we must first understand what the brain does when left to itself. Modern neuroscience has moved beyond viewing the brain as a collection of regions performing discrete tasks, and toward understanding it as a network of networks, clusters of areas that communicate preferentially with one another, creating functional modules. One such network, the default mode network, has garnered particular attention. It includes the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate cortex, and parts of the parietal lobe. The default mode network is most active when we are not focused on external tasks, when we daydream, remember the past, imagine the future, or think about ourselves. The default mode network is, in a sense, the neural correlate of the self. It constructs the narrative I, the continuity of identity across time, the sense of being a person with a history and a future, separate from others. This is not a bad thing. It allows for planning, self-reflection, and social navigation. But it also reinforces boundaries. Me versus you, past versus present, what I am versus what I could be. Psilocybin, studies suggest, decreases activity in the default mode network. At the same time, it increases connectivity between networks that normally operate relatively independently. Visual and auditory areas start talking to emotional centers. Memory regions sync with sensory input. The brain becomes less modular and more globally integrated. Subjectively, this manifests in several ways. The boundary between self and world softens. Music feels not just heard, but experienced as structure, emotion, and narrative all at once. Memories surface with unusual vividness and emotional weight. Thoughts lose their linear quality and become associative, metaphorical, imagistic. People report ego dissolution, a term that sounds alarming but describes something often felt as relief. The constant, narrating, judging I quiets. What remains is awareness without a fixed centre, perception without the perceiver, or a perceiver so diffused into experience that the boundary between observer and observed becomes porous. This is not psychosis. Psychosis involves loss of reality testing, an inability to distinguish internal experience from external fact. Psilocybin users, even during profound experiences, generally retain an understanding that the state is temporary and caused by a substance. They can, if needed, communicate and respond to their environment. The shift is in salience, not insanity. Imaging also shows increased connectivity between the visual cortex and other areas, which may underlie the geometric hallucinations often described. Tessellations, fractals, spirals, lattices, and symmetries that seem to arise from the architecture of perception itself. These patterns are not random but reflect how the visual system organizes information. Edges, contrasts, repetitions, normally suppressed or ignored, now vividly foregrounded. The lasting effects, improved mood and reduced anxiety reported weeks or months later, remain partially mysterious. One hypothesis is that the temporary disruption of rigid patterns allows new connections to form. Depression and addiction are in part diseases of fixed perspective, rumination loops, entrenched habits, narratives that no longer serve but cannot be escaped. Psilocybin may act as a kind of neural reset, not erasing patterns but loosening them, creating plasticity that makes change possible. But this is still hypothesis. The brain is not a computer to be rebooted, and metaphors mislead as often as they clarify. What we know is that something shifts, in networks, in narratives, in the felt sense of possibility. Why these shifts sometimes persist and sometimes fade remains an open question, one that science is still learning to ask properly. 3 words appear again and again in both traditional and modern. Contexts for psychedelic use: set, setting, and intention. They sound simple, almost trivial, yet they represent a distillation of centuries of accumulated wisdom about how to navigate altered states safely and meaningfully. Set refers to mindset, the psychological, emotional, and cognitive state a person brings into the experience. Are they anxious or calm, curious or fearful, grieving or celebratory? The molecule will amplify what is already present. A person in quiet curiosity may encounter wonder. A person in unresolved trauma may encounter that trauma, vividly and unavoidably. Preparation, therefore, matters. In clinical trials, participants meet facilitators multiple times before the session, building trust, discussing intentions, exploring fears and clarifying what they hope to learn or heal. This is not indoctrination but grounding, a reminder that difficult moments may arise and that they can be met with breath, presence, and support. Setting refers to the physical and social environment. Is the space safe, comfortable, and free from interruption? Is lighting soft or harsh? Is the music carefully chosen or chaotic? Are trusted people present, and do they understand their role as witnesses rather than directors? In traditional ceremonies, setting is crafted with immense care. Participants gather at dusk in a prepared space, often circular, with symbolic objects, candles, icons, instruments, arranged to communicate safety and intention. Modern clinical settings echo this. Comfortable couches, warm blankets, eye shades to turn attention inward, and playlists that move through stages mirroring the arc of the experience. Rising, peaking, integration, and return. The presence of guides is crucial. Their role is not to interpret or instruct, but to hold space, to remain calm when the participant is not, to offer reassurance without intrusion, to trust the process. Good guides know that the most helpful intervention is often silence, or a single sentence spoken at the right moment. You are safe. Let go. Trust. Intention is perhaps the most subtle of the three. Why is this person here? What question are they bringing? What do they hope to understand, release, or transform? Intention is not a demand. Psilocybin does not respond to commands, but a compass. It orients attention without dictating destination. In Mazatec tradition, participants state their intention before consuming the mushrooms. I seek healing for my son, or I need guidance about this conflict. The healer listens, and the songs she sings later echo these themes, weaving intention into the fabric of the experience. The mushrooms, it is believed, hear the intention and respond, not magically, but because intention shapes attention and attention shapes experience. In clinical settings, intention is articulated in preparation sessions. I want to understand my depression. I need to let go of my fear of death. I want to reconnect with my capacity for joy. These intentions are revisited during integration, becoming lenses through which to interpret what unfolded. Together, setting, and intention form a container strong enough to hold the unknown. Without them, the same molecule can lead to confusion, fear, or harm. With them, even difficult experiences can become transformative. The chemistry is the catalyst. The container is the crucible where transformation occurs. How does one describe the indescribable? Language evolved to navigate the everyday, objects, actions, social exchanges, not to capture states where subject and object dissolve, where time becomes elastic, and where emotion arrives in waves too large for single words. Yet people try. Across centuries and cultures, certain themes recur in reports of psilocybin experiences, even when the experiencers have no prior knowledge of what others have described. This consistency suggests that the effects, while subjective, are not arbitrary. Visual phenomena are among the most reliably reported. With eyes closed, geometric patterns emerge: grids, spirals, fractals, mandalas, tessellations. These are not hallucinations in the sense of seeing things that are not there, but alterations in how the visual system processes information. The patterns are often described as intricate, beautiful, and imbued with a sense of significance, though what they signify remains mysterious. With eyes open, surfaces breathe, textures become more vivid, colours intensify or shift. Faces may appear to morph subtly, revealing emotions or archetypes beneath the familiar. Nature, trees, water, sky, often feels alive in a way difficult to articulate, as though consciousness extends beyond the merely human. Time, many report, becomes strange. A moment stretches into eternity, an hour passes in seconds. This is not metaphorical. The brain's usual sense of temporal flow, maintained by memory, prediction, and routine, loosens. Without the default mode network anchoring experience in narrative time, the present expands, becomes all there is. Emotionally, experiences range widely. Some report profound joy, love, and gratitude, a sense of being held by something larger than themselves, whether they name it God, nature, or the cosmos. Others encounter grief, fear, or regret, revisiting losses or traumas with an intensity that can be overwhelming but also clarifying. Laughter is common, tears are common, and sometimes both arrive at once, indistinguishable. A recurring theme, especially in higher dose experiences, is what researchers call mystical type experiences, scored using standardized questionnaires. These include a sense of unity or oneness with all things, transcendence of time and space, deeply felt positive mood, sacredness, ineffability, the sense that words fail, and paradoxicality, holding contradictory truths simultaneously. Such experiences are not unique to psilocybin. They are reported in meditation, near-death experiences, prayer, childbirth, and spontaneous peak moments. What psilocybin does is reliably and predictably occasion them in a significant percentage of users, particularly when conditions are supportive. Another common theme is encounter, meeting entities, presences, or archetypes. Some describe conversations with deceased loved ones. Others meet guides, animals, or beings of light. Are these real? Are they projections of the unconscious? The question is less interesting than the fact that the encounters feel real, and their messages, often simple, often kind, can have lasting impact. Many report insights, sudden clarity about relationships, habits, life direction, or purpose. These are not intellectual conclusions, but felt truths, arriving with emotional weight. I saw that I have been afraid to love. I understood that my mother did the best she could. I realized I do not have to carry this anymore. Whether these insights endure depends on integration, the work of translating vision into action. But not all experiences are positive. Some are neutral, confusing, or boring. Others are terrifying, confrontations with death, dissolution, chaos, or personal shadow material. These difficult experiences, when held with support, can be among the most therapeutically valuable, though they are not easy to endure. The mushroom does not promise comfort. It promises truth, and truth is not always gentle. To speak of benefits without acknowledging risks is to fail in honesty. Psilocybin is not benign simply because it comes from nature. Hemlock is natural. Nightshade is natural. Nature is indifferent to human well-being, and molecules do not carry moral weight, only consequences. Physically, psilocybin is remarkably safe. There is no known lethal dose in humans. The LT50 in animal studies is extraordinarily high. Overdose is not a concern in the same way it is for opioids or alcohol. Psilocybin is not addictive. Tolerance develops quickly and fades within days, discouraging frequent use. It does not damage organs with repeated use, but psychological risks are real and non-trivial. The most common acute risk is a bad trip. Overwhelming fear, paranoia, panic, or confusion during the experience. This is more likely with high doses, unsupportive settings, or pre-existing anxiety. While temporary, such episodes can be deeply distressing, and without proper support they may lead to dangerous behaviour, fleeing into traffic, jumping from heights, harming oneself or others in a state of terror. A rarer but serious risk is hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, in which visual distortions continue long after the substance has left the body. Symptoms include trails, halos, or persistent geometric patterns. For most, this is transient and mild. For a few, it is debilitating and chronic. The incidence is unclear, the mechanism unknown, and treatment options limited. More concerning is the potential to precipitate or worsen serious mental illness in vulnerable individuals. Psilocybin can trigger latent psychosis in those with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. It can exacerbate depression or anxiety in some cases, though it alleviates them in others. Screening is essential, and even with screening, risk cannot be entirely eliminated. Certain medications are dangerous to combine with psilocybin. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors, used for depression, can lead to serotonin syndrome, a life-threatening condition involving fever, agitation, and muscle rigidity. Lithium, used for bipolar disorder, has been associated with seizures when combined with psychedelics. SSRIs may blunt effects, or in rare cases interact dangerously. Medical oversight is not optional. Legal risks also exist. In most jurisdictions, psilocybin remains a controlled substance. Possession, cultivation, or distribution can result in criminal charges, incarceration, and lasting legal consequences. Decriminalization efforts are expanding, but they are patchwork, inconsistent, and subject to change. Legality is not morality, but consequences are real regardless of one's philosophical stance. Finally, There is the risk of harm from impure or misidentified substances. Street psilocybin may be contaminated or mislabeled. Mushrooms gathered in the wild may be misidentified, leading to poisoning. This is not a theoretical concern. People die every year from consuming toxic mushrooms they believe to be psychoactive. Expertise in mycology is specialized and essential. Confidence is not competence. The responsible position is clear. These substances carry risk. They are not for everyone. They are not to be used casually, frequently, or without care. They demand respect, preparation, and, ideally, guidance. To pretend otherwise is to invite harm. Under the hush of rain, picture a forest floor, threads passing sugars and signals between roots, fruiting bodies rising after a storm, spores drifting like quiet thoughts. Whatever one's view of psychedelic mushrooms, sacrament, tool, or topic for study, the calm truth remains. A small organism can open very large questions, best approached with respect, caution, and care. The fungus does not judge our uses or misuses. It simply grows, fruits, and returns to the soil, part of the great cycle that predates and will outlast all human meaning-making. In the end, perhaps the deepest lesson is not about visions or therapy or altered states, but about humility, the recognition that we are not separate from nature but woven into it, participants in exchanges we barely understand, walking briefly through a world far older and stranger than our stories can contain. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. Before men knew the secret of the forge, before bronze gleamed in sunlight or iron sang against stone, there were only sharpened rocks and splintered wood. The world was vast and wild, and humanity, soft of skin and slow of foot, clung to survival by wit alone. It was fire that changed everything. Not the tame flame of the hearth, though that too was a gift, but the discovery that flame could transform. That heat, applied with patience and purpose, could turn dull earth into something harder than bone, sharper than claw. The first smiths were not craftsmen, but alchemists of a kind, watching red-hot stones crack and soften, learning through burned hands and failed attempts that certain rocks, when heated, would weep metal. Copper came first, soft, malleable, beautiful as beaten gold, but far more common. It could be shaped into tools that held an edge longer than stone, vessels that didn't crack in fire, ornaments that caught the light and proclaimed their wearer's wealth. Villages that learned its secrets grew strong. Those that didn't fell behind or were swallowed whole. But copper alone was not enough. A copper blade bent in battle, dulled against harder stone, failed when men needed it most. And so the search continued, generation after generation, smiths experimenting with different stones, different temperatures, different combinations. It was accident, as so many great discoveries are, that revealed the next step. Tin, a rare metal, soft and nearly useless on its own, when mixed with copper in the heat of the crucible, produced something new, something stronger, bronze. The discovery rippled outward like a stone cast into still water. Bronze tools cleared forests faster. Bronze ploughs bit deeper into soil. Bronze weapons. Bronze weapons. These changed the very nature of power. A man with a bronze sword could face 10 with copper. A king with bronze-armed warriors could carve an empire from the flanks of his neighbours. The Bronze Age had begun, though no one living then would have called it such. They knew only that the world had grown harder, sharper, more dangerous, that smiths became valued as priests once were, their forges sacred spaces where earth became something more than earth. The earliest bronze smiths worked in secrecy, guarding their knowledge as jealously as any miser guards gold. The ratios were crucial. Too much tin and the metal grew brittle, shattering on impact. Too little, and it remained soft as copper. 9 parts copper to 1 part tin. This was the formula whispered from master to apprentice, protected by oaths and sometimes by blood. Kingdoms rose on the strength of their bronze. In Mesopotamia, in the valley between 2 rivers, cities grew tall behind bronze-tipped walls. In Egypt, pharaohs commanded armies sheathed in bronze scale, their chariots fitted with bronze wheels that could crush bone without breaking. Across the sea, in Crete, the palace at Knossos held storerooms stacked with bronze ingots, each stamped, with the sign of the double axe. And in the lands that would one day be called Greece, bronze flowed like water during summer, pouring into moulds for spearheads, swords, armour, and the great round shields that would thunder against each other at Troy. But bronze required trade. Copper could be found in many places, but tin was rare, concentrated in distant lands. Control the tin routes, and you controlled the age. Merchants became powerful, their ships crossing seas, their caravans threading through mountain passes. Wars were fought not for land or glory alone, but for access to the mines that fed the forges. The smith's craft was both art and agony. The furnace had to burn at precise temperatures, hot enough to melt the metals but not so hot they burned away. Bellows pumped by strong arms or patient feet pushed air through charcoal, raising the heat until the crucible glowed white. The smith, face gleaming with sweat and soot, would pour the molten bronze into moulds of clay or stone, each shaped for its purpose. Swords were not simply poured and finished. The blade, once cooled and removed from its mould, was rough, pitted, imperfect. It had to be ground against stone, edge after edge, until the bronze took on that peculiar sharpness, not as keen as later iron would be, but deadly enough. Then came the polishing, the fitting of the hilt, the balance tested and retested until the weapon felt like an extension of the arm rather than a tool held in the hand. The greatest smiths signed their work, or marked it with symbols known only to initiates. A fine blade might carry the mark of its maker for generations, passed from father to son, bearer to bearer, its edge resharpened 100 times until the bronze grew thin and finally failed. In war, bronze sang. Shield against shield, the crash echoed across battlefields. Spears shattered against armour, or punched through where the bronze was thin or poorly made. Swords, shorter than those of later ages, were used to stab and hack in close quarters, where men's breath mingled and blood ran in the dust. The heroes of that age wore bronze as both protection and proclamation. Achilles' armour, forged by Hephaestus himself if the poets are to be believed, was described in loving detail. The shield with its scenes of war and peace, the breastplate that turned aside every blow, the greaves that encased his legs. Whether divine or merely masterful, such armour marked a man as more than common. It spoke of wealth, of favour, of a life lived in proximity to power. Yet bronze had its limits, and those limits would doom the age that bore its name. Bronze was expensive. A full set of armour required resources beyond the reach of common soldiers. Armies were small, elite forces of bronze-clad warriors supported by masses of lightly armed men with wood and stone. This concentration of power in the hands of the few shaped societies, creating rigid hierarchies where warriors ruled and the rest served. Bronze was also fragile, in ways that mattered. Blades notched and bent, requiring frequent repair. Armour dented under heavy blows, and once bent, bronze was difficult to restore to its original shape. A long campaign could see a warrior's equipment degrade to near uselessness, with no forge nearby to mend it, and bronze required tin. When the trade routes broke, whether through war, piracy or the collapse of distant kingdoms, the supply faltered. Smiths hoarded what they had, melting down old tools to make new ones, reusing bronze from generation to generation. In some places the shortage grew so severe that bronze itself became a form of currency, weighed and traded as carefully as gold. The end came slowly, then all at once. Iron was everywhere, not free and pure, but locked in rust-red stones that lay scattered across hillsides, riverbanks, and shallow mines. For centuries men had seen these stones and thought nothing of them. You could not melt iron in a Bronze Age furnace. The temperatures required were far beyond what bellows and charcoal could achieve. Iron, when it appeared at all, came from the sky, meteorites that fell blazing and were worked cold, hammered into small blades or ornaments rare as any treasure. But sometime, somewhere, the records are lost or were never written. A smith discovered something new. Iron did not need to melt. Heated to a red glow in a furnace packed with charcoal, iron could be worked. The metal, still solid but softened by heat, could be hammered, folded, hammered again, the impurities driven out by patient blows. What emerged was not pure iron, but steel. Iron with just enough carbon to give it strength. The process was brutal. The smith worked for hours, heating and hammering, arms aching, lungs choked with smoke. The metal had to be kept at the right temperature. Too cold, and it cracked. Too hot, and it burned. But when done correctly, when the smith's skill and the fire's heat aligned, the result was a blade that could hold an edge sharper than bronze, harder than copper, and far cheaper to produce. Iron did not require distant tin. The ore could be found almost anywhere. A village with a good smith and access to iron-bearing stone could arm itself, could stand against bronze-wielding lords who had ruled unchallenged for generations. The monopoly on violence, held for so long by those who controlled the bronze trade, began to crack. The transition was not peaceful. Bronze kingdoms did not simply lay down their weapons and accept the new order. They fought desperately, using their bronze arms to crush iron-working villages, burning forges, killing smiths. For a time it seemed bronze might hold. The old powers were entrenched, their armies disciplined, their treasuries deep. But iron spread like water, finding cracks in stone. A smith driven from one village would appear in another. The knowledge, once learned, could not be unlearned. And every soldier who picked up an iron blade and found it lighter, sharper, more reliable than bronze, became a convert to the new age. The collapse, when it came, was total. Historians call it the Bronze Age collapse, a cascade of disasters that swept across the Mediterranean and Near East around 1200 BCE. Cities burned, empires fell, trade routes vanished. The great palace economies that had sustained the bronze trade crumbled, and with them went the old certainties. Into the chaos came iron, not as saviour, but as survivor. Iron could be worked locally without the extensive trade networks bronze required. A small community could sustain a smith. A tribe on the move could carry the knowledge with them. When the dust settled and men began to rebuild, they built with iron. The early iron was crude. Smiths were still learning, still experimenting. Blades were brittle or soft, snapping in combat or bending like copper. But the craft improved, generation by generation, technique by technique. Smiths learned to quench heated iron in water or oil, shocking the metal into greater hardness. They learned to temper the quenched blade, reheating it gently to reduce brittleness, finding the balance between hard and flexible. Pattern welding emerged. Multiple strips of iron and steel twisted and forged together, creating blades with distinctive patterns in the metal and strength beyond what any single piece could achieve. These blades were art and function intertwined, their wavy lines proof of the smith's mastery. The sword changed shape. Bronze swords, limited by the metal's properties, had been relatively short, designed for stabbing as much as cutting. Iron allowed longer blades, true cutting weapons that could strike from farther away. The spatha of Rome, the gladius of the legions, the long swords of northern tribes, all were made possible by iron strength. Armour too evolved. Iron plate could be thinner than bronze and still turn a blow. Mail, thousands of interlocking iron rings, provided flexible protection that moved with the body. A warrior in iron mail was better protected than one in bronze plate, and could move more freely besides. But iron's true revolution was not in quality but in quantity. Bronze armies had been small, elite forces. Iron armies could be vast. When every farmer could afford a spear, every village a militia, the nature of war itself transformed. Battles grew larger, bloodier, more decisive. Kingdoms that could field thousands of iron-armed men swept away those that could not. The smith, once a figure of mystery working in isolation, became central to community life. Every town of any size had its forge, the ring of hammer on anvil marking the hours. Children gathered to watch the sparks fly, to feel the heat rolling from the furnace, to imagine the blades that would be born from the fire. And still the craft evolved. Different cultures developed different techniques, each suited to their needs and materials. In India, smiths learned to produce woot steel, so fine-grained and hard it seemed, magical. In China, blast furnaces reached temperatures hot enough to actually melt iron, producing cast iron for tools and weapons. In Japan, smiths developed elaborate rituals around sword-making, folding steel thousands of times to create katanas of legendary sharpness. The Romans, practical as always, standardized their smithing. Every legion had its fabricae, workshops that produced weapons and armor to consistent patterns. A legionary's gladius was not an artwork, but a tool, designed to be reliable, replaceable, effective. The empire ran on iron ploughs that fed the cities, iron tools that built the roads, iron weapons that held the borders, Iron changed agriculture as profoundly as it changed war. Iron ploughs could break ground that bronze could not, opening marginal lands to cultivation. Iron axes cleared forests faster. Iron saws cut timber more cleanly. The population grew because the land could support more people, and the increased population demanded more iron, a cycle that fed itself for centuries. Yet iron had its own vulnerabilities. It rusted. Unlike bronze, which aged to a noble green patina, iron exposed to moisture and air crumbled to red powder. Blades had to be oiled, armour kept dry, tools cleaned after use. Neglect meant decay, and decay meant starting over. The quality of iron varied wildly. A blade forged by a master could last generations. One made by an apprentice might shatter in its first fight. Knowing good iron from bad became crucial, and tales spread of legendary swords and cursed blades, of weapons that brought victory or doom. Some swords earned names. Excalibur, Durandal, Tyrfing, Graham. These were not merely tools but characters in their own right, passed from hero to hero, stained with the blood of giants and kings. The naming of swords suggests something deeper, that the blade, forged in fire and quenched in water, tempered by hammer and heat, contained something beyond metal. Not a soul, perhaps, but a history. Each notch, each stain, each repair told a story. Iron made kingdoms, but it also made heroes. A skilled warrior with a fine blade was worth a dozen common soldiers. Legends grew around swordsmen whose speed and strength seemed superhuman. Miyamoto Musashi in Japan, William Marshall in England, the warriors of myth and saga who could cut through enemies like wheat before the scythe. But heroism in iron was different from heroism in bronze. The Homeric heroes fought in single combat, their bronze arms gleaming, their deeds witnessed by gods. Iron Age warriors fought in lines, shoulder to shoulder, their shields locked, their spears thrust together. There was glory still, but it was shared among the ranks, distributed through the legion or phalanx, rather than concentrated in individual champions. This democratization of violence had profound effects. When every citizen could be a soldier, citizens demanded rights. The hoplite armies of Greece, free men fighting for their cities, became the foundation of democracy. The Roman legions, recruited from among the people, shaped the Republic and later the Empire. Power flowed not just from noble blood, but from the ability to forge iron and train men to use it. Iron also made possible the Great Migrations. Tribes armed with iron weapons and tools could move into new lands, displacing or absorbing those they found. The Celtic expansion across Europe, the Germanic migrations that would topple Rome, the spread of Bantu peoples across Africa, all were enabled by iron. Those with the metal advanced, those without retreated or perished. Iron served well for centuries, but it had limits. Pure iron was too soft for the most demanding uses. The carbon content picked up from the charcoal during forging was inconsistent. A blade might be steel near the edge and nearly pure iron at the spine, its properties varying even within a single piece. What smiths needed was control. Steel, iron with a specific controlled amount of carbon was the answer, but achieving it reliably took time. The crucible steel of India and Persia showed what was possible. Small batches of iron and carbon-rich materials sealed in clay vessels and heated for days, producing ingots of remarkably consistent high-carbon steel. But the process was slow, expensive, and produced only small amounts. The real breakthrough came much later, in the Industrial Age, when furnaces could be built large enough and hot enough to process iron ore in bulk. The Bessemer process, developed in the mid-1800s, blew air through molten iron, burning out impurities and excess carbon in minutes rather than days. For the first time, steel could be made in quantity. What followed was a revolution that dwarfed even the transition from bronze to iron. Steel was stronger, more consistent, more versatile than anything before. It could be cast into massive shapes for bridges and buildings, rolled into thin sheets for ships and trains, drawn into wire for cables and springs. The modern world, the world of skyscrapers and rail networks, of automobiles and aircraft, was built on steel. Yet the fundamental process would be recognizable to any ancient smith. Heat, hammer, quench, temper. The principles remained the same even as the scale exploded. The difference was precision. Modern metallurgy measured carbon content to hundredths of a percent, controlled temperatures to single degrees, tested strength and flexibility with scientific rigor. The mystery became a science, but the transformation at its heart Earth made into something more remained. Swords, once the pinnacle of smithcraft, became obsolete. Firearms changed war more profoundly than iron ever did. But the sword lingered in ceremony, in sport, in the imagination. A sword is never just a sword. Oh, on the surface, yes, it is a length of sharpened steel, a hilt for the hand, perhaps a guard to protect the fingers. But deeper, tangled with history and symbol, it is more. It is authority and violence, protection and threat, law and defiance. It is the power to take life, carried openly, its presence a statement that needs no words. In the hands of a king, the sword is sovereignty. Coronation blades, jewelled and ancient, were laid upon the monarch's shoulder not merely for show, but to invoke the old compact. The king protects the realm, and the realm follows the king. The sword of state carried point up before the throne was the unsheathed promise that justice, or its shadow, would be done. In the hands of a knight the sword was honour. The blade blessed by priests, sworn over before witnesses, became an extension of the oaths that bound the warrior to lord and code. To break your word was to dishonour your sword, to fight without honour was to make the blade meaningless. Medieval ritual held that a knight's sword should not touch the ground, for the earth would shame it. Whether this was ever truly practised or merely poetic fancy, it spoke to how the weapon was imagined. As something pure, elevated, separate from base use. In the hands of a commoner, the sword was revolution. When the people took up weapons meant for their betters, when peasants forged crude blades or seized fine ones from fallen lords, the social order trembled. Sumptuary laws and weapon regulations tried to keep swords out of common hands, but such laws were honoured mainly in the breach. A man with a sword, whatever his birth, was a man to be reckoned with. Different cultures shaped different blades, and each blade shaped the culture in turn. The Roman gladius, short and broad, was designed for the press of the legion, for stabbing into the gaps between shields while your own shield protected you. It was a tool of discipline, of coordinated violence, and it built an empire on that discipline. The Viking sword, longer and double-edged, was meant for the individual warrior, the raider who fought in looser formations where room to swing was available. These blades were named and treasured, passed from father to son, sometimes buried with their owners to serve in the afterlife. The sagas tell of swords that sang in battle, that thirsted for blood, that brought doom to those who wielded them unworthily. The Japanese katana, curved and single-edged, was designed for the draw cut, a technique where the blade was drawn from the scabbard and swept through the target in a single motion. The curve helped the blade slide rather than chop, and the differential hardening, soft spine, hard edge gave flexibility and sharpness together. The katana became the soul of the samurai, its forging ritualized, its care a meditation. The longswords of medieval Europe, with their cross guards and longer hilts, allowed two-handed grips for more powerful strikes. These were weapons for armoured combat, designed to bash through defences or find the gaps in plate. Curved sabres, adopted widely in cavalry, were ideal for slashing from horseback. The curve concentrated force at the tip during a swing, and the motion of the horse added speed and power. Hussars and dragoons, Cossacks and Mamluks all favoured the sabre for mounted combat. Rapiers, slim and lethal, emerged as armour declined and civilian duelling rose. These were precision weapons designed to slip past defences and find the heart or throat. The rapier duellist relied on speed, timing, and technique rather than strength. Fencing became an art, and the swordsman an artist, his blade an extension of his will. But weapons carried weight beyond their physical mass. Every blade used in anger bound the wielder to its consequences. A soldier who killed in war carried those deaths, whether mourned or forgotten. A duellist who ran his opponent through might claim honour, but the blood remained. And the executioner's sword, heavy-bladed and blunt-tipped, carried the weight of the state's judgment, each swing ending a life by decree rather than passion. Swords appeared in law as well as war. To swear upon a sword was to invoke its power as witness. To break a sword was to break its wielder's status. Knights were unmade by having their blades snapped before them. To present a sword, hilt first was to offer peace. To present it point first was to offer battle. Magic clung to swords in story and sometimes in belief. Blades forged at lucky times, tempered in exotic quenchants. bull's blood, a virgin's tears, the urine of a red-haired boy, these were said to hold special properties. Whether any such method actually affected the steel is doubtful, but the belief mattered. A warrior who trusted his blade fought differently than one who doubted it. Cursed swords appeared in legend, weapons that brought doom to their owners, that could not be sheathed without drawing blood, that drove their wielders mad. These tales served as warnings. The sword grants power, but power corrupts. Violence answered with violence begets only more violence. Holy swords too filled the stories. Blades blessed by saints, carried by heroes chosen by gods, weapons that could only be drawn by the worthy, or that glowed in the presence of evil. Excalibur, most famous of these, was not won by strength but by destiny. Pulled from stone by the one true king, the message was clear: power must be legitimate, and legitimacy comes from something beyond mere force. In the end, a sword is a tool for cutting. That's the practical truth, unromantic and stark. But tools shape their users as much as users shape tools. Smiths made the weapons, but warriors made the legends. And some warriors, through skill or fate or the strange alchemy of timing and temperament, became more than warriors. They became heroes, their names outlasting their bones, their deeds growing in the telling, until history and myth tangled together too tightly to separate. What makes a hero? Not merely skill at arms, though that helps. Not simply victories, though those are necessary. Something else, harder to define. The moment where choice crystallizes into action, where an individual steps forward when others step back, where the story finds its center. Achilles, if he existed, was likely a skilled warrior among many during the Bronze Age raids that memory compressed into the single tale of Troy. But Achilles the hero, sulking in his tent while his countrymen die, dragging Hector's body in rage and grief, accepting his own doom to avenge his beloved, this Achilles is more than a fighter. He is the embodiment of glory and its price, of Kleos, the undying fame won at the cost of life itself. Heracles, strong beyond mortal measure, performed labours that were equal parts feat and penance. He did not merely slay monsters. He cleaned stables, captured animals alive, descended into death itself and returned. His strength was celebrated, but his tragedies, the madness that made him kill his family, the poisoned shirt that killed him, these too were part of the legend. Sigurd, or Siegfried in the German telling, slew the dragon Fafnir with a sword reforged from his father's broken blade. The weapon was named Gram, and it could cut through an anvil. But Sigurd's doom came not from inadequate arms, but from human treachery, from love and oaths broken, from the curse that gold carries. Roland, defending the pass at Roncesvalles, blew his horn until his temples burst, refusing to call for help until too late. His sword, Durendal, was said to contain holy relics in its hilt. In his dying moments, Roland tried to break the blade so it wouldn't fall into enemy hands, but Durendal was unbreakable. The hero died, but the sword endured. Miyamoto Musashi, perhaps the greatest swordsman of Japan, wrote that the way of the warrior was the way of death. His Book of Five Rings detailed strategy and technique, but also philosophy. The mind must be calm, the strike must come from emptiness, the warrior must be ready to die at any moment. Musashi fought 60 duels and never lost. His final years were spent painting and writing, his sword set aside, but his reputation never dulled. Joan of Arc led armies but claimed she never killed anyone, that she carried her banner into battle rather than wielding a blade. This might have been true or strategic. A peasant girl claiming divine visions was unlikely enough. A peasant girl killing noblemen would have been too much. Not all heroes were noble. Some were monsters by any measure, their heroism residing in their effectiveness rather than their virtue. Attila, whose name became synonymous with destruction, was a brilliant commander who almost toppled Rome. Genghis Khan, whose conquests buried cities under rubble and stacked skulls in pyramids, nevertheless unified nations and established laws. And some heroes were made not by what they did, but by what they endured. Spartacus, a slave who led a rebellion, was no demigod. He was a gladiator, trained to kill for entertainment, who chose death fighting for freedom over life in chains. The hero's journey, as scholars have noted, follows patterns. The call to adventure, the trials, the transformation, the return. But the weapons they carried also followed patterns. The blade is earned or inherited. It has a name, a history. It may be lost and regained, broken and reforged. The weapon becomes a companion, almost a character itself. When Beowulf's sword fails against Grendel's mother, he must find another, older, left by giants. When Arthur's sword breaks, he receives Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake. The hero and the blade are bound together. Steel still surrounds us, hidden in plain sight. The frame of every building, the engine in every car, the cutlery on the table, the springs in the pen, all steel, all descendants of that ancient craft. Yet the sword is gone from daily life, retreated into museums and ceremonies, martial arts studios and fantasy novels. When did it end? Not with a sudden break, but with a long, slow obsolescence. Firearms appeared in the 14th century, crude tubes of metal that threw stones or metal balls with explosive force. They were inaccurate, slow to reload, dangerous to the user. A skilled archer could kill more efficiently. A knight in armour could charge through gunfire and cut down gunners before they could reload. But firearms improved, generation by generation. Matchlocks gave way to wheel locks, then flintlocks. Barrels grew rifled, spinning the bullet for accuracy. Cartridges replaced loose powder, speeding reload times. Breech loading replaced muzzle loading, and eventually repeating firearms, weapons that could fire multiple rounds without reloading, made the battlefield utterly lethal. The sword lingered longest in the hands of cavalry. A mounted man with a sabre could still scatter infantry, at least until machine guns made cavalry charges suicidal. Officers continued to wear swords through World War I, though actually using them was rare and usually fatal. The sword had become vestigial, carried because tradition demanded it, no longer because it might be needed. There is magic in transformation, not the magic of spells and sorcery, but the deeper magic of taking one thing and making it another. Rock into metal, metal into blade, blade into tool or weapon, and through its use, a change in the world itself. The smith stands at that nexus, hands burned and scarred, face lit by the forger's glow, and works a small miracle. To hold a sword, even a dull replica, is to feel history in your hand. The balance, the heft, the way it moves when you swing it. These things connect you to everyone who ever held such a weapon, everyone who lived when steel meant survival. That connection matters. In a world of abstract violence, where wars are fought with drones and missiles, where the killer never sees the killed, the sword remains a reminder of an older, more personal kind of conflict. Not better, not more honourable, but more honest perhaps. When you look into your enemy's eyes as your blade enters his body, you cannot deny what you've done. The sword permits no distance, no abstraction. It makes violence intimate, and in that intimacy, terrible. The forge of heroes is not made of iron and fire, but of circumstance and choice. The blade helps, yes, but the temper comes from within. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy. In the beginning, there was neither one nor two nor any number at all. There was only the undifferentiated vastness, the everything-nothing that needed no counting because there was no separation, no this and that to tally. But from that ancient silence came the first stirring of distinction, the moment when something became aware of itself as separate from not itself, and in that instant, counting was born. Not as symbols or words, but as the raw recognition of difference, the primal noticing that here is one thing and there is another, and between them stretches the beginning of all mathematics. The earliest humans did not inherit numbers. They made them slowly, across generations whose names are lost. A hunter watching the moon's faces learned to anticipate the fourth darkness, the return of light. A gatherer counting children at dusk felt the absence before seeing the empty space. These were not calculations, but heartbeats of attention, the mind's way of holding more than the eyes could see at once. The first numbers were not written, but felt, carried in the body's memory like the weight of a carried child, or the rhythm of footsteps toward home. Then came the marks, not grand declarations, but small scratchings, made by hands that never imagined they were inventing anything at all. A piece of bone, a stretch of bark, a cave wall softened by moisture and shadow. 4 vertical lines, then a diagonal fifth crossing them like a gate closing. The tally bundle. Simple, repeatable, readable by firelight or dawn. A shepherd could mark each sheep that passed, then count the marks when the flock returned, and know without naming whether all had come home. The marks were patient. They did not fade with sleep or blur with hunger. They waited, holding their small truth until someone returned to read them. This was the first revolution, though no one called it that. Memory had moved outside the skull. A mark on wood could outlast the person who made it, could be read by a stranger, could survive winter. The tally was a bridge between minds, between moments. It said, I was here, I counted this, and now you can know what I knew. In those scratches lies the seed of every spreadsheet, every database, every ledger that has ever balanced or failed to balance. Counting began as an act of care, a way to remember what mattered enough to mark. But tallies alone could not grow large. Try marking 1,000 with single strokes and the eye drowns in a forest of lines. The mind needs chunking, grouping, hierarchy. And so the body offered its first abacus, 10 fingers, held high in sunlight or low by the fire. Counting on fingers is so old it feels like instinct, but it is learned, passed from parent to child in the same breath as language. 1 finger, 2, 3, up to 10, then the hands reset or the count continues on to toes. Base 10 is an accident of anatomy, but it stuck because it was always there, ready to be recruited, visible to others, impossible to lose. Some cultures counted differently. Herders in distant valleys touched the spaces between fingers, the knuckles, the joints, building base 12 on a single hand by using the thumb as a pointer. 12s feel stable, divisible by 2, 3, 4, 6. Friendly to barter and splitting loads. Others used base 20, fingers and toes together, which left traces in their language. 4 20s for 80, a count that travels up the whole body before resetting. The base we use shapes the numbers we favour, the prices we set, the hours we divide. Counting is ergonomics before it is abstraction, a tool fit to the hand that holds it. As settlements grew, so did the need for larger counts and longer memories. Pebbles replaced fingers. Small stones slid into grooves scratched in clay or wood, one groove for ones, another for tens, another for hundreds. The stones themselves held no value, only their position mattered. A calculus, they called it. A little stone. Move 3 stones from the ones groove to make room, add 1 to the tens groove, and you have performed addition without symbols, without ink. The answer lives in the arrangement, not in marks. Merchants became fast at this, their fingers dancing over rows, seeing sums as shapes, reading speed into rhythm. The abacus is a musical instrument for arithmetic, each bead a note, each column a scale. But language carried its own arithmetic, hidden in the words themselves. Some tongues named only 1, 2, and many, stopping where daily life rarely needed more. Others built elaborate word chains for every number up to 100, each name a compound of roots that pointed backward to fingers, heaps, or ancestors. In some languages, 20 is said as 1 person, meaning all the digits of hands and feet. In others, 11 is 1 over 10, and 20 is 2 tens. These are not translations but choices, small cultural answers to the question of how often a number needs its own name. The words we inherit shape what feels easy to say, and therefore easy to think. Then came the idea that changed everything, though it arrived quietly without fanfare. Place value. The notion that a symbol's meaning depends on where it sits. In a tally, every mark means 1. But in a place value system, the same digit can mean 1, or 10, or 100, depending on its column. This seems simple now, so simple we teach it to children before they lose their first tooth, but it was not obvious. For centuries, systems like Roman numerals resisted it. An X always meant 10, no matter where it appeared. Addition was possible but clumsy. Multiplication was a specialist's craft. Place value collapsed that complexity, turning arithmetic from a rare skill into a common one. The Babylonians glimpsed it first, using wedge-shaped marks in clay, their numbers built in base 60, a system so practical for dividing circles and time that we still live inside it when we read a clock. But it was Indian mathematicians who perfected the idea, pairing place value with 9 distinct digit symbols and a 10th symbol for nothing. That 10th symbol, the dot that became a circle, was 0, and it did 2 things no number had done before. It held a place, marking the empty tens column so that 105 did not collapse into 15, and it named an amount, none. 0 allowed subtraction to cross boundaries, allowed algorithms to run without special cases, allowed algebra to ask what happens when quantity vanishes. A calm idea, with astonishing consequences. The symbol for zero spread slowly, carried by traders and scholars across borders. Europe resisted it for centuries, clinging to Roman numerals and abaci, suspicious of a number that represented nothing. How could nothing be something? The question felt like a trap, a riddle that undermined the solidity of counting. But commerce does not care for philosophy. Merchants needed to add long columns, to track debts across seasons, to multiply prices by quantities without hiring a specialist. Place value with zero made all of that possible, fast, and checkable. By the time printing presses arrived, the Hindu-Arabic numerals had won, not by argument, but by utility. Yet Roman numerals linger. They mark the copyright year on films, number the hours on clock faces, label chapters in old books, and engrave the cornerstones of monuments. They persist not because they calculate well, they do not, but because they look formal, ancient, authoritative. A reminder that numbers live in two worlds, the practical world of ledgers and measurements, and the symbolic world of identity and tradition. Aesthetics can outlast utility when the function is no longer daily survival, but the marking of occasion. Before decimals smoothed everything into tens, the world divided by halves, thirds, and quarters. Bakers split dough into even portions. Builders measured beams in fractions of cubits. Brewers knew their casks by eighths. The Egyptians used unit fractions, refusing to write 2/7 and insisting instead on 1/7 plus 1/7, or finding stranger decompositions like 1/4 plus 1/28. This seems laborious now, but it made fairness explicit. Every fraction was a single clean cut, a portion that could be seen and checked. Fractions are the mathematics of sharing before abundance, the arithmetic of making do with what is, dividing it justly among those who wait. Some numbers became cultural favourites not by accident, but by their friendliness to division. 12 divides by 2, 3, 4, and 6, making it a merchant's friend. Eggs come in dozens. Hours split cleanly into halves and quarters. Feet divide into inches by 12s. The number feels cooperative, willing to break into even pieces without remainder or fuss. Cultures chose 12s and 6s not because they understood number theory, but because market stalls and kitchen tables rewarded what split cleanly. The world quietly selects for numbers that make daily life smoother, and those numbers lodge themselves into units, prices, and proverbs. As trade expanded, so did the need to measure, not just count. How long is this rope? How heavy is that grain? How far to the next village? Early measures were bodily, a cubit from elbow to fingertip, a pace from heel to heel, a grain of barley as the smallest weight. These were approximate, personal, but they travelled without tools. A forearm is always with you. But markets demand consistency. A bushel in one town must match a bushel in the next, or trust collapses. Standardization crept in, first as royal decrees, this rod is the king's foot, this weight the true pound, and later as international agreements. The metric system cleaned the table with tens, aligning all measures to a single base, making conversion a matter of shifting decimal points rather than memorizing tables. Units are agreements more than truths, social contracts written in measurement. As numbers grew, intuition failed. We feel the difference between 3 and 4, can picture 5 without counting. But beyond a handful, the mind goes blurry. 1,000, 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000. These are not quantities we sense, but magnitudes we calculate. Place value and commas help, breaking long strings into readable clusters, but even then the scale escapes. 1,000,000 seconds is 11 days, 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years. Comparisons like these are the only bridge between number and feeling, the only way to drag vast counts back into the realm of the imaginable. Large numbers live mostly as symbols, their size understood through analogy rather than direct experience. Hidden among the integers are the primes, numbers that refuse to be divided evenly by anything smaller than themselves. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. These are the atoms of arithmetic, the building blocks from which all other numbers are made by multiplication. The primes scatter irregularly along the number line, their gaps widening on average but unpredictably in detail. No formula generates them neatly, no pattern governs their arrival. They have been studied for millennia, not for practical use at first, but for the beauty of the puzzle. Now they secure encryption, their difficulty protecting passwords and transactions. They also appear in nature, in the life cycles of cicadas that emerge every 13 or 17 years, avoiding predators locked to shorter cycles. Simple rules yield deep mystery. Primes remind us that the world's order is neither perfectly regular nor entirely random. Numbers reveal patterns when arranged spatially. Multiplication tables form grids where diagonal stripes and symmetries appear. Pascal's triangle, a simple pyramid built by adding neighbours, blooms with binomial coefficients, Fibonacci sequences, and fractal self-similarity. Even a humble addition chart, coloured by odds and evens, produces a checkerboard. These patterns are not decorations but clues, hints that arithmetic has textures and rhythms underneath its symbolic surface. Numbers become music when you see them as shapes, and shapes become numbers when you count their structure. Uncertainty, too, can be counted. A die has 6 faces. Roll it, and any face might land up, but over many rolls each face appears about 1/6 of the time. Probability begins here, in the simple act of listing possibilities and counting how many satisfy a condition. What are the chances of drawing 2 red cards in a row from a shuffled deck? Count the favourable outcomes, count the total outcomes, divide. The calm insight. Randomness is not lawless. Averages tell truths that single events cannot. Weather, insurance and genetics all rest on this foundation. Counting the possible, weighing the likely, preparing for distributions rather than certainties. Some numbers grow by doubling. A single bacterium becomes 2, then 4, then 8. Interest compounds, rumours spread, populations explode. Exponential growth feels slow at first, then shockingly fast, each step larger than all previous steps combined. Logarithms, the inverse of exponents, turn this multiplication into addition, making slide rules possible and mental estimation easier. If something doubles every year, ask not how big it will be, but how many doublings it will take. Exponents are time made numeric, a way to compress long sequences into a single power. Everyday life rewards rough calculation. In a grocery aisle, round prices to the nearest dollar, group items by tens, estimate totals before the register. At a restaurant, split a bill by friendly numbers, rounding up to include the tip. Estimation is permission to be wrong by a little in order to be fast and confident. It privileges sanity checks over precision, catching errors in magnitude before they compound. The skill is not taught as often as is exact arithmetic, but it is used more often, a quiet fluency that separates those who fear numbers from those who play with them lightly. Some numbers guard others. A check digit, calculated from the digits that precede it, catches typos and transpositions. Barcodes use them, credit card numbers end with them, ISBNs encode them. The idea is simple. Weight each digit by position, sum them, and see if the result follows a rule, divisible by 10, matching a particular remainder. If a number fails the check, it is almost certainly wrong. This invisible net catches most accidental errors before they propagate, a small redundancy that makes modern infrastructure possible. Counting protects counting, a loop of verification woven through transaction systems. Calendars, too, are counted patterns, compromises between incommensurable cycles. The moon circles the Earth in roughly 29.5 days, but 12 lunar months fall short of a solar year. The 7-day week belongs to neither, a cultural rhythm inherited from ancient Near Eastern traditions, neither lunar nor solar but simply habitual. To keep planting seasons aligned with dates, leap years add a day, every 4 years, with exceptions every 100 years, and exceptions to those exceptions every 400 years. The arithmetic is fussy but necessary, a set of corrections that keep January in winter and August in summer. Calendars are negotiations with astronomy encoded in the arithmetic of days. Not all counting uses digits. In the Andes, Quipus recorded data in knotted chords, each knot a number, each colour a category, each chord a ledger line. In parts of Africa, drum rhythms carried census counts across distances, the beats naming quantities without words. In Polynesia, notches on sticks tracked fish caught per season, the pattern readable without language. These systems are not primitive but tailored, matching the form of counting to the medium at hand. Structure can encode information as surely as symbols. Sometimes the structure is the message, but numbers, for all their clarity, can mislead. An average hides the shape of data. A mean income says nothing about the gap between rich and poor. A mean temperature says nothing about daily swings. A large sample of biased data remains biased, no matter how many observations it contains. Before trusting a count, ask how it was gathered, what it includes, what it ignores. Numbers look decisive, but they are always abstractions, summaries that collapse detail. The calm rule: question the counting method before accepting the count. Some numbers feel complete in themselves. Triangular numbers, 1, 3, 6, 10, stack as pebbled pyramids, each row one pebble longer than the last. Square numbers tile into grids without gaps. Perfect numbers, rare and strange, equal the sum of their divisors. 6 is 1 plus 2 plus 3, 28 is 1 plus 2 plus 4 plus 7 plus 14. These are not useful in daily life, but they satisfy something in the mind, a recognition of order and closure. Small perfect things, geometries where arithmetic and shape align. Counting can also calm. Breath practices use numbers to slow the heart. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 7, exhale for 8. The attention required to count crowds out anxious thoughts. The rhythm steadies the nervous system. Repeating primes, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11, occupies the mind without summoning images that might disturb. Counting becomes a lullaby, a tether for attention, a gentle discipline that loosens the grip of wakefulness and allows sleep to arrive. From the first scratch on bone to the zeros flickering in server farms, counting is the low hum beneath civilization. It is markets settling at dusk, calendars turning over at midnight, steps counted by devices in pockets, debts tracked across generations. Every number is a memory kept, a sum shared, a preparation for tomorrow. The arithmetic is often invisible, embedded in prices and schedules and the quiet confidence that what was counted once can be counted again. It is the gentlest of technologies, requiring no fuel but attention, no power but patience. The history of counting is also the history of trust. To count is to believe that marks persist, that others will read them as you did, that agreements can be made across distance and time. A tally on bark says, I was here, and this is true. A check digit says, this number is probably right. A calendar says, we will meet again when the count returns to this point. Every number is a small promise, a structure built from nothing but agreement and repetition, yet strong enough to hold markets, harvests, and the rhythm of waking and sleep. And so counting continues, in classrooms and spreadsheets, in genetic sequences and pixel grids, in the tick of clocks and the hum of satellites. It is the oldest tool still in daily use, refined but not fundamentally changed, still doing what it did when the first hand scratched 4 lines and a 5th across them. It holds memory outside the mind, makes the invisible visible, turns the uncountable into the counted. It is the arithmetic of care, the ledger of what we notice and choose to track, the quiet insistence that the world, for all its chaos, can be marked, measured, and, sometimes, understood. In the beginning there was no number, only vastness. Then came the noticing, the marking, the counting, and with it the slow construction of a world where things could be compared, combined, and carried forward. That world is ours, built one tally at a time, each mark a small anchor against forgetting, each sum a bridge between what was and what will be. The rain falls softly, the numbers accumulate, and in the morning the marks remain, patient and readable, waiting for the next hand to count them again. Children learn counting as ritual before they learn it as concept. They sing the names, 1, 2, 3, in order, performing the sequence like a charm, not yet understanding that each word corresponds to a quantity. The sounds come first, a memorized string that only later detaches into individual meanings. A child might count correctly to 10 but still believe that rearranging a row of buttons changes their number, that spreading them wider makes them more. The leap from recitation to conservation, from chant to comprehension, is slow and uneven, different for each mind. We are not born counting. We grow into it, gradually, learning to see quantity as a property that persists through transformation. Teachers use objects, blocks, beads, apples, to ground the abstractions. One apple can be touched, bitten, given away. 3 apples sit heavier in the hand than 2. The child learns by handling, by grouping and separating, by discovering that 5 can become 2 and 3, or 4 and 1 and still be 5. These are not axioms taught, but truths discovered through play. Arithmetic begins as physical manipulation, as the rearrangement of things in space, and only later migrates to symbols on paper. The journey from concrete to abstract is not a straight path, but a spiral, revisiting the same ideas at deeper levels, until numbers float free of their original objects and become entities in their own right. Some children take to counting naturally, delighting in the patterns, finding comfort in the predictability of increment. Others resist, confused by the gap between the symbols and the sensations, unsure why adults care so much about assigning names to quantities. There is no moral dimension to this difference, only variation in the way minds attend to the world. Some see quantity first, others see colour, shape, or story. Mathematics education often treats the first group as normal, and the second as deficient, but both are simply human. The trick is not to force everyone through the same narrow gate, but to show how counting serves purposes that matter, how it lets you share fairly, plan journeys, build structures that stand, ensure that what you started with returns. In some classrooms, counting is taught through movement. Children hop on numbered tiles, clap in rhythm, arrange themselves in groups of 3 or 5. The body learns before the mind names what it knows. This is old wisdom, rediscovered cyclically. Counting is a bodily skill before it becomes abstract thought. The fingers remember, the feet keep time, the voice finds the cadence. When symbols arrive, the written 1, 2, 3, they attach to experiences already embodied, giving shape to what was previously only sound and motion. As children grow, the numbers grow with them. Addition and subtraction at first are just counting forward and back. Multiplication is counting in leaps, a faster way to reach the same totals. Division is sharing or grouping, making equal piles until nothing remains. These operations do not feel like new inventions, but like natural extensions of the original act of counting, new ways to move through number space. The abstractions come later, negative numbers that cannot be held, fractions that name parts, variables that stand for unknowns, but they build on the foundation laid in early childhood, when counting was a song and 4 meant 4 beads on a string. Yet even adults carry remnants of that early concreteness. We visualize numbers spatially, seeing them rise on a number line, picturing larger numbers to the right and smaller to the left. This is learned, not innate. Some cultures picture numbers rising upward, others see them flowing in other directions. But once learned, the spatial metaphor becomes invisible, shaping how we think about magnitude, direction, and change. Numbers are not just quantities, but positions, locations on a mental landscape we navigate without conscious effort. The tools we use to count shape the counting we do. When calculation required a Barchi or written tallies, only those trained could handle large numbers quickly. Literacy in arithmetic was a specialised skill, the domain of clerks and merchants. The printing press changed this, making tables and textbooks cheap enough to spread. Then came mechanical calculators, clunky and precise, followed by electronic ones that fit in a pocket. Each wave of technology lowered the barrier to counting, shifting the cognitive load from memory and manual skill to interpretation and decision. Now a device can sum a column in an instant, but knowing whether the sum is reasonable still requires a human mind. The machines count, we judge the counts. This shift has made numeracy both easier and harder. Easier because the drudgery is automated, harder because the volume of numbers we encounter has exploded. Every transaction generates data. Every click is logged and counted. We swim in numbers, most of them invisible, aggregated into dashboards and charts that summarize without explaining. The old skills, mental arithmetic, rough estimation, feeling for magnitude, matter more, not less, because they are the only defense against drowning in digits we do not understand. A spreadsheet can lie as easily as it can tell the truth, and the lie is harder to spot when the numbers look clean and the formulas are hidden. In some schools now, children learn to code before they master long division. This is neither good nor bad, but a shift in emphasis, a recognition that algorithms are the new literacy. To code is to count in a new way, to write instructions that count on your behalf, looping and branching through possibilities faster than any human tally. The logic is still arithmetic. Increment this, check if that. But the scale is different. A program can count to 1 billion without tiring, can search through millions of records in seconds. The child who writes such a program may not know the times tables by heart, but understands counting as process, as something that can be encoded and repeated. The nature of fluency is changing, and with it the shape of what we call numeracy. But underneath the technology, the ancient operations persist. A tally is still a mark. A sum is still the bringing together of separate counts. The faster we move, the more we rely on those foundations, often without knowing it. Every algorithm rests on addition, every search on comparison, every ranking on counting and sorting. The old arithmetic has not been replaced but buried under layers of convenience, doing its work invisibly, reliably, as it has for millennia. The hand that scratched 4 marks and a 5th in firelight would recognize the logic, if not the form, of what happens inside a microchip. There is also a politics to counting. Who gets counted and how determines who is seen, who receives resources, who exists in the official record. Censuses map populations but also erase those who slip through, the homeless, the undocumented, the ones who move too often to be pinned down. To be uncounted is to be invisible, to have no claim on services or representation. Counting can be an act of inclusion or exclusion, a way to acknowledge or ignore. The numbers are never neutral, though they pretend to be. Behind every count is a choice about what to measure and why. Businesses count obsessively, tracking inventory, sales, customer behavior, seeking patterns in the noise. The goal is prediction, the ability to anticipate demand before it arrives, to optimize stock so that nothing sits unsold and nothing runs out. This is the arithmetic of efficiency, where waste is the enemy and every number is a lever for profit. But the counting can become its own purpose, the metrics displacing the mission, until what matters is not the quality of the product or the satisfaction of the customer, but the movement of numbers on a dashboard. When counting becomes separated from meaning, it becomes a ritual without purpose, a performance for its own sake. Sports too are thick with numbers. Scores, times, distances, percentages. Every game is a cascade of counts that tell a story the eyes alone cannot. Statistics summarize seasons, rank players, predict outcomes. Fans argue over numbers as if they were sacred texts, finding in them evidence for claims that cannot be settled by watching alone. The counting here is not neutral either. It highlights what is measured and ignores what is not. Speed and points are easy to count. Effort and grace are harder. The numbers shape the game, rewarding what they track and discouraging what they do not. In medicine, counting saves lives. Dosages depend on weight, height, age, numbers that must be correct to the decimal or the cure becomes poison. Lab results are counts of cells, concentrations of chemicals, thresholds that divide healthy from sick. Clinical trials rest on counting how many improve, how many worsen, how many stay the same, comparing treatment groups against controls. The entire edifice of evidence-based medicine is built on counting carefully, tracking outcomes, adjusting when the numbers shift. Here the stakes are human, immediate, and the arithmetic is unforgiving. Environmental science counts to understand collapse, how many species remain, how fast the ice melts, how much carbon accumulates in the air. These are counts made across decades, stitched together from scattered observations, adjusted for changing methods and missing data. The numbers are uncertain but necessary, the best guess at scales too large to see directly. They are predictions as much as measurements, models built on counts that project forward into possible futures. The counting here is an act of care, a way to hold the world accountable, to measure what we are losing before it vanishes entirely. And in the quietest corners, people still count for themselves, for reasons that have nothing to do with markets or science. A gardener counts seeds, plants, harvests, learning the rhythms of growth. A knitter counts stitches, rows, repeats, building fabric from thread and attention. A parent counts breaths in the night, watching a sick child, counting as a way to stay present, to mark time until the fever breaks. These counts are private, unrecorded, but they matter as much as any ledger. They are the arithmetic of devotion, the careful attention that turns repetition into ritual. Counting, in the end, is a way of being in the world. It is a discipline of noticing, a commitment to track what might otherwise blur or vanish. It says, this is worth marking, worth returning to, worth comparing against what came before. The marks accumulate, on bark, on screens, in memory, and together they form a record, imperfect but persistent, of what was here, what happened, what we chose to watch. The counting will continue as long as there are minds to mark and compare, as long as there is something that matters enough to tally. And when the last count is made and no one remains to read it, the marks will still be there, waiting, holding their small truth in the silence. The next story is about to begin. Please relax and enjoy.